In this episode of the Slow Boat Sailing Podcast, we're going to talk to Professor Martin Burtscher of the University of Innsbruck. Not only is he a professor at this elite university in Austria, but he's also one of the world experts on hypoxic conditioning for athletes and the effects of altitude for mountaineering. And we're going to link to a couple of his papers in the description of this podcast or video. So the big point of this is I've done some kind of high altitude climbs. I'd say above 5,000 meters. The effects of acclimatization become a lot more important. So if you think about the three factors that are going to affect the success of your mountaineering summit expedition, number one is your physical fitness, right? You can control that. But there's a second factor, your acclimatization. That is, how many days have you spent getting ready, your body ready, making respiratory system changes, blood changes, so that when you go to sleep at higher altitude, you do not get symptoms of acute mountain sickness. So typical symptoms of that is headache, nausea, inability to sleep, possibly vomiting, extreme shortness of breath, dizziness. And then if those symptoms progress and you do not descend, or you ascend, or you increase your activity levels and try to pour through it, then you could be diagnosed with HAPE or HACE, high altitude pulmonary edema, or high altitude cerebral edema, which are life-threatening illnesses that kill mountaineers all the time, every year in high altitude peaks above 5,000 meters, but they also kill people at lower altitudes. So the typical prescription for this is to go up by about 300 to 500 meters per day, or 1,000 to 1,500 feet per day, and then maybe rest fourth day. So a conservative prescription would be you increase when you get to 8,000 feet or 2,500 meters. Then you only go up by 300 meters or 1,000 feet per day. So you stay at 8,000, then you go up and sleep at 9,000, then you go up to sleep at 10,000, then you go up to sleep at 11,000. So one per day. So if you're talking about getting to Everest Base Camp, that's about 18,000 feet. So you should start your gradual ascent at about 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. You should start that about 9 days or so before that. And 9 days translates into about, 9 times 24 translates into about 216 hours. And so in this podcast, I was really surprised by Professor Burtscher's response on this. I thought he would be much more equivocal, but he strongly believes, I think, that these normabaric altitude generators work. So when you go to real altitude, the pressure of air reduces, and effectively the amount of oxygen you get into your blood reduces. So at the top of Everest is about a third the oxygen, or as at sea level. Whereas if you get to, so one way of thinking about that is you have the third amount of oxygen, even though it's true that you always have 21% oxygen no matter where you are in elevation. One way of thinking of that is you could divide 21 by 3 and you only have 7% oxygen. And for most people that's nearly fatal if you went up there right away. They call it the higher parts of Everest the death zone, above 7,500 meters. We have been seeing that a lot of Everest expedition providers, guiding companies have been encouraging their clients to do fast ascent expeditions where they spend 300 hours in a generator, say 6 to 8 weeks, to pre-acclimatize, and that basically works out. So if you're thinking about if you're in a tent or you're using a mask that's connected to a hypoxic generator that puts out extra nitrogen to reduce the amount of oxygen that you're breathing, I think from the discussion here with Martin Burtscher, Professor Burtscher, that we should think of each one of those hours and divide those hours by 24. And so once we get above 8,000 feet or 2,500 meters, we need to go up 300 meters in elevation or 1,000 feet in elevation with the hypoxic generator and skip that portion of the acclimatization. Then we need to add up 24 hours on the hypoxic generator. And so that's why we're seeing these kind of 6 weeks acclimatization schedules, assuming that people are just sleeping 8 hours a day, because it takes them that long to get to kind of the base camp of Everest levels, or camp 1 of Everest levels of acclimatization. And I think that's consistent with, the news reports that I discussed on the channel earlier about Adrian Bollinger, how he acclimatized for Troy Oyu, that he waited, used his normabaric oxygen generator, and using the tent method to sleep at 18,000 feet, which is kind of like Everest base camp levels, and it was a 6-week plan that he did. I'll make one other distinction, that while we're talking mostly about these altitude generators, this is not an endorsement of the so-called altitude masks, which are not hooked up to a generator. There's little evidence that those work at all, and it's kind of, I think, is a scam, although I didn't discuss this with the professor, but when I'm talking about a mask, I'm talking about a mask hooked up to a hypoxic generator, reducing the amount of oxygen that you breathe. Why is this important? Because saving time on the mountain means that A, it's going to be less expensive for the expedition, you have to take off less work, and B, a lot of expeditions start at relatively high altitude. So if you go into Ecuador, or if you go into La Paz, Bolivia, you're already at a very extreme altitude. Then you really do need to pre-acclimatize just to get to Quito, Ecuador, and sleep there. You have to pre-acclimatize just to get to Camp -1 on Aconcagua, because it's a very extreme altitude for most people. And if you don't, then you have to do that locally, and you have to build in extra time outside of your expedition, because most guides will not get you pre-acclimatized to that first camp. And I think this discussion is very different than the discussion about altitude generators with respect to cycling, for example. So a lot of the focus on cycling and running is to get around the anti-doping rules. And as Kilian Jornet says in his blog, which we'll probably link in the description, there are no doping rules in mountaineering. So there's nothing to stop people from taking EPO to increase their blood oxygen, or do blood doping, as Lance Armstrong did and lost his titles for, because there is no, for most part, mountaineering has no kind of organizing body. It is not a competitive sport, especially for peaks that have been climbed many, many times, such as Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Denali, or Everest, or the 8,000 meter peaks. All those have been climbed many, many times. So it's all about style, but the benefits that you can get from kind of increasing your red blood cell mass through this is a relatively small percentage, whereas you probably are, so maybe you could increase your VO2 max by 3%, but one of his co-authors argued that every time 1,000 feet elevation you gain, you lose 6 to 7% of VO2 max. So if you're going up 8,000 meters, 8 times 6 is 48, 8 times 7 is 56, you're going to lose about 50% of your VO2 max going up 8,000 meters. And if using this tent you increase your hemoglobin mass so that your VO2 max goes up by 3%, that's not a really significant effect. The significant effect is avoiding these altitude illnesses that will cause you to have to slow down your ascent, that is, kind of add an extra day to the expedition, or maybe kind of kick you out of the expedition if you're in a really tight expedition with a very inflexible guiding company. Having to go down once means you have to leave the whole mountain in many cases. So being properly acclimatized for that objective not only could save your life, but it could also, save the expedition. Whereas if you were just doing this to get a 3% increase in VO2 max and you're cycling, well, if you're 3% slower on a cycle, you're still going to complete the course. You're not going to die because you didn't have enough hemoglobin in your blood. You're just going to be a little bit faster. Whereas with mountaineering, you could possibly die. The whole expedition could fail, like if you didn't finish a race. at the very least, it's probably going to delay your expedition much more than 3% if you come up with AMS symptoms. You're at the University of Innsbruck. Why don't you tell us your position and what your main area of interest is?
Yeah, I am a retired professor at the University of Innsbruck, and my main interest is exercise physiology, and especially high altitude physiology, high altitude sicknesses, performance at high altitude, and so on. And especially what happens to the human organism in extreme environments.
That's what we're going to talk about today. That's why I asked you to come on the Slow Boat Sailing podcast and YouTube channel, was because I thought you were the world expert on this sort of stuff. So the articles that I'd read were your kind of more recent articles, this hypoxia conditioning for high altitude pre-acclimatization, and then high altitude illness, old stories and new insights into the pathopsychology, treatment, and prevention. So our listeners are like me. We have no scientific background, or I'm a social scientist. Business is my area, but we don't have a lot of background in physiology. So someone that familiar with the medical literature like you are, or the physical education literature. I think the focus of this is I've been reading this stuff about the normabaric hypoxic generators. These are the generators that put out lower percentages of oxygen to simulate altitude, the amount of oxygen that the body could draw in at higher altitudes. So if you go up to Everest, you can take in about a third of the oxygen that you can at sea level. But the problem is that it's a little different at Everest. That the reason why is that there's 21% oxygen all over the world, but because the air pressure is less at Everest, you only take in a third of the oxygen, right, at the summit of Everest. This really, I think, is kind of the problem, I think, for people that are going after kind of the 7 summits or whatever, like Kilimanjaro or Aconcagua or the 8,000ers or whatever, or 7,000 Andes Mountains or 7,000 meter peaks or 6,000 meter peaks in Asia, is that the expeditions start taking longer and longer because it takes more and more time to get your body up to speed for this. And so there's a lot of popularity among some outfitters out there. I saw Mountain Madness doing this, and then more famously this Alpenglow, that say that they can do this with generators, and I'm just not so sure that it's true based on what's in the literature, because most of the literature is about, can you increase your red blood cells count? Yes. And will you run 3% faster? Probably, maybe, in your triathlon or swimming thing. So what do you think about these normabaric generators that pump nitrogen into the air and people get into tents or wear masks that are attached to them?
I think hypoxia is the real cause for high altitude illnesses. I think there is no question. That's really true. And if our body have time enough to adapt to the various levels of hypoxia, the body will better tolerate hypoxia and high altitude. And therefore, acclimatization is really key for well-being at high altitude, for tolerating high altitude, to avoid mountain sicknesses, and to maintain as much as possible of your sea level performance. And therefore, if you can adapt before going to high altitude, or you can also do that directly when you have time enough on the mountain, then you will surely benefit from this hypoxia exposures. It doesn't much matter whether it's normobaric or hypobaric hypoxia. Of course, there are small differences between this, but hypoxia is key for all these things that happens at high altitude. And this is long known, especially Paul Bear told that, and he did a lot of experiments and showed that it is really hypoxia. As a diver, you also fall bear, and since this time it's clear hypoxia is the reason for all higher for not tolerating high altitude. And if there is time enough to spend at high altitude, you will be acclimatized and you will probably not have any problems with regard to high altitude sickness. Of course, there are several other things, weather conditions, climbing skills, and so on, that all will, and temperature will play a role for the success at the mountain. But to tolerate hypoxia, you have to expose to hypoxia before going to high altitude or directly when you are climbing on the mountain. But that needs time, and acclimatization needs time. That's the problem. There are several responses from the organisms.
Let me just interject right here. Yeah, so I think that you made a good point that I didn't kind of put out there, was that, you know, one of the causes of death of mountaineers on the, I'd say, top 5 is AMS, Acute Mountain Sickness. 2 of those that typically cause deaths are HAPE and HACE, due to going up too fast or other improper acclimatization. It's right up there with avalanches, falling, in terms of deaths. And it also has a big impact on whether or not, you know, if people have even mild AMS, that could mean that if they are in a tight expedition that's maybe guided, that they don't really control the time very well, that they'll have to slow down, and maybe that'll keep them from completing the expedition with the summit. So I think our focus is kind of on the mountain sicknesses associated with this. And so when I read the literature, so I have this sheet from Hypoxico. I did my own literature search, but I read Hypoxico's, which is one of the generator sellers, who's not sponsoring this podcast, and I don't own one of their generators. I could not find a single article that said going in normabaric hypoxia for any amount of time reduced your chances of AMS significantly, that is, with statistical significance. It had, yeah. So do you agree with that, or is that wrong? I mean, are there studies out there that show that being in a tent or wearing a mask hooked up to a normabaric generator reduces your chances of AMS significantly?
Yes. No, there are several studies really showing that hypoxia exposures before going to high altitude or before exposed to high altitude in normobaric or hypobaric hypoxia at real altitude or simulated altitude show that these exposures can significantly reduce AMS or can even prevent AMS. Some remarks to the high altitude illnesses. Acute mountain sickness is a real problem. It's very inconvenient and uncomfortable, and probably you will have severe headache and will suffer from nausea and vomiting and so. And it really delays your ascent to the mountains, and you will not be happy on the mountain. But there are 2 really life-threatening, as you already mentioned, illnesses. This is HAPE, high altitude pulmonary edema, and high altitude cerebral edema. And what not directly the use of normobaric hypoxia, but what acclimatization studies show is that acclimatization can really markedly reduce or prevent these severe forms of high altitude illnesses. And it seems logical, if you acclimatize at home in normobaric or hypobaric hypoxia, that should initiate some of these physiological and cellular responses, also showing the same effects as real acclimatization on the mountain. And there are several studies indicating that. It's always a problem. You have so many studies, and most of these studies exposed very different, using very different types of protocols. Some hours, not severe hypoxia, more severe hypoxia, sleeping during the night in hypoxic tents and so on. But when summarizing all the studies, you can see that it's a matter of dosing and timing, and most importantly, the overall duration is important. And when we summarize, we could say that about 1 week stay at simulated or real altitude will induce ventilatory acclimatization, nearly a complete ventilatory acclimatization. If you will completely acclimatize to high altitude, you will have to spend weeks or months at high altitude. But that's not feasible for most of the mountaineers, and therefore you will have a compromise between optimal acclimatization and time sparing. And that means that ventilatory acclimatization, a very important part of acclimatization, should be completed. And there are several studies showing that when you spend about 8 days at high altitude, plus minus, with individual differences, you will be completely acclimatized, ventilatory acclimatized. Oxygen saturation will be higher, your minute ventilation has increased, and so on. And this is a very important response associated with reduced risk of acute mountain sickness, with increased endurance performance, and increased well-being. One problem, because you told that there is probably no study showing significant effect on AMS. Most of the studies only used some hours. We did one study with 7 hours and showed that small effects arise from 7 hours. Others show 20 hours, 60 hours, and so on. 8 days mean about 200 hours are necessary, whether continuously or intermittently exposed to hypoxia. And there are very, very few studies that really expose humans for such a long time. They did it at real altitude, and that worked, but they did it not in normabaric hypoxia. But we did some case studies, and there are other groups who did this similar studies. You are right, it's only case studies, but they expose people before going to the Everest, for example, for 6 to 8 weeks during the night, and then you will have 200 hours or 300 hours of hypoxia exposure, and that really works.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So your feeling on the intermittent part of it is that it's just the sum of the hours. So if it's only 7 hours a day, that still should have some effect as long as you put enough of those days together.
Right.
I think the other thing that I was kind of disappointed in the hypoxic literature, because I think it's really focused on bicyclists, runners, swimmers, and I think that in particular it's focused on avoiding doping but having the same effects of blood doping, that is increasing your red blood cell count so you can improve your swimming, biking performance, let's say hypothetically by 3%, but it varies, right? And so to me, if you have a 3% increase in your VO2 max and thus can go up the mountain 3% faster when you get to your limits, that does not really affect a mountaineer that much. It's helpful, but it doesn't really. Whereas AMS you're gonna lose at a minimum a day if you get mild AMS, and you're gonna slow down by a day. But it may be that the whole expedition is scrapped because you have to slow down more than you have time, or you're going to get something more severe and have to be evacuated or something, or go down completely because you have to. It's a life-threatening situation. I just find that kind of disappointing that there's been so much effort put into oh, we can improve our race times by X percent, which is a small percent, less than 10, versus something that really is 100% for a mountaineer, right? AMS is 100% for a mountaineer, but VO2 max improvement in a racing situation it's not going to keep you from finishing. It just is whether you finish first or fourth or 20th or 26th.
I fully agree. We are talking about two very different things. One thing is to adapt to hypoxia, acclimatize, and especially increase your ventilation and your arterial oxygen saturation to provide more oxygen during the high altitude exposure than if or compared to non-acclimatized conditions. That really works after 8 days exposure to hypoxia. But to stimulate significantly erythropoiesis and to increase VO2 max needs much longer time. These effects you will see about after 2 or 3 weeks, starting with very little effects or really no effects, and some other high altitude factors may counteract these effects, but erythropoiesis increases if you are staying at altitude for weeks or even months. But that is not so important for the high altitude climber. That may be important, as you told, for the runners and cyclers, endurance athletes, but not for the climber. For the climber, it's important to feel well at altitude, to not suffer from mountain sickness, and to restore some of the performance loss. But this performance loss is especially due to the reduction of oxygen when you are acutely exposed. But if you are breathing more during the days of exposure at altitude, your arterial oxygen saturation will increase, and the delivery of oxygen to your muscles will increase, and your muscles and your heart and your organism will adapt and use this a little bit more oxygen, which really improves much of your endurance performance. You are right. There are not many or large effects in endurance athletes, but acclimatization is really key, and there are large effects in mountaineers.
In terms of the pre-acclimatization, how fast does it wear off? So do we have any idea about how fast it wears off? So if you take a week break or 2-week break or a month break or 2-month break?
Great question. If you need about 1 week to acclimatize to ventilatory, I'm now speaking from the ventilatory acclimatization. As we told, there are several other responses or adaptations that need much more, but ventilatory acclimatization is a very important thing for the altitude mountaineer to provide to prevent from acute mountain sickness and especially from severe altitude illnesses. And it takes about 1 week up to 4,000 to 5,000 meters. And it may be neat, but it's not so easy to apply to more extreme altitudes. And it will need, it's really evidence-based that 1 week is enough to induce ventilatory acclimatization, and about 2 weeks are needed above 5,000 meters, somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks. Or if you apply hypoxia intermittently, you will need about 200 hours up to 5,000 meters, and you will need about 300 hours if you are going higher. And the only tool you can really go higher is probably the use of normabaric hypoxia, because you can there use the dose as you like, at least up to about 7,000 meters. Hypoxicators do not offer more severe hypoxia at the moment.
So say somebody did this like 300-hour program and then they were going to Everest, right? and they had a gap between where they would say they're at sea level and then they go to Everest 3 weeks later. Would they lose all that acclimation?
Sorry, I didn't answer your question. You need 1 to 2 weeks to acclimatize, and this will be retained for about 1 to 2 weeks. It's a rule of thumb. You will benefit from this acclimatization depending on the time you spend for acclimatization. 1 week acclimatization, you will lose your acclimatization about after 1 week. If you have spent 2 weeks or 3 weeks with pre-acclimatization, you will benefit from the 2 or 3 weeks. But most important, you should use pre-acclimatize methods very close before going to the dark jet expedition or trekking tour or whatever.
I think one of the things that I was just kind of struck, there was like a 2002 study that did they did a survey of people going up to the Margarita Hut in the Alps, which is 4,600 meters approximately. Yeah. And they asked the mountaineers all these different questions, and then they did a multinomial logit model, which I do logit models all the time. And that's kind of what we do in business. We get data, and we don't do randomized placebo trials. Instead, we get this data about what people are doing, and we have it on several different dimensions, and then we run a regression and see what's significant. And there was this 2002 study that did that for the Margarita Hut, which I thought was very helpful. It told me, what worked, what didn't work. Of course, at that time, there was not really these normabaric generators. I don't think these really became the rage until the later 2000s and into the teens. I just wondering why doesn't somebody put a survey of mountaineers at Mount Everest, and there's full-time physicians there, right? So there's a co-author right there that passes out this survey with consent, and then somebody does a regression and asks them about these normabaric generators, so we have more than kind of anecdotal studies of normabaric generators and how effective they are and how effective people's pre-acclimatization was or was not.
Yeah, it's a very good suggestion. In fact, there are pretty old studies using normabaric and hypobaric hypoxia for pre-acclimatization from the States. You probably know from
the Felco.
Go on the
Fulco.
The military guys that did these very, very great studies showing evidence-based that the more you are exposed, or the longer you are exposed, the more effectively will this pre-exposure prevent from acute mountain sickness. I think that it's really evidence-based.
It is, but it's very cumbersome because you have to have this placebo-controlled trial, and you have to have this specified amount of stuff. So you have to convince a large number of people, which is really hard to do that. Yeah. And versus a survey, people are they're just doing it. They're doing things, and you're asking them what they're doing, and in their variation of what they're doing, you can draw out. Because you're not going to get a drug approved. You're just trying to figure out what's going on.
Fully agreed. Yeah, most of these epidemiological studies only using questionnaire and so on, they have to be interpreted very carefully. As you told, there are so much differences between people and what happens during the travel. Some get sick and very different ages and different comorbidities, and some take medications for prevention and some don't take, and they don't sleep well in their tents and so on. So there are many confounders, and those studies will not really help. They give some indications which factors or predictors should really included in more standardized studies, but we need bigger studies, well controlled studies performed in very standardized conditions. Some years ago, we did a study we did several studies at real altitude with normabaric and hypobaric or normabaric hypoxia, only to see what happens when people exposed for 12 hours or more hours. And we had a study including nearly 80.
Well, we got cut off by Zoom there, but we continued our conversation over the phone, and here it is. So you were saying about your study that was about 8 hours long, and it
was 12 hours long, and we included nearly 80 people looking what happens, especially studying physiological responses and the incidence of acute mountain sickness, recording symptoms, and so on. And what I would tell is that these studies are complicated because of the many devices you have to use, because of the many recordings you have to perform. And if you perform such a study with pre-acclimatization in normabaric hypoxia, and then you have to go to real altitude, you have many influential factors when you are going to real altitude. That starts with the travels, with the diet you are using, with the weather conditions, with different sleeping conditions, and so on. And what I would say is you are completely right. We have to do such well-controlled studies in a standardized way, but it will not be easy to do. And then I think many researchers do rather these epidemiological studies to go on and ask people, how did you prepare and how do you feel?
Yeah, I think my point was that, for instance, there was a lot of studies of Aconcagua in like 2009, 2010 area, and they just passed out surveys. And if you have a large enough number, actually the variation in what people are doing and their backgrounds is not actually bad for you. It's good for you because it allows you to draw statistical inferences if you have a large enough data set. So instead of trying to create a laboratory environment and getting people to behave, which is really hard to get people to do things right, in my opinion, that you just see what people are doing, and if you have enough surveys back and you control for those factors in a multivariate setting, then you can make inferences. Is kind of the point. So, for instance, we know exactly when these rapid ascent expeditions are supposed to land on be on Everest or on Ojos or on Aconcagua. We know exactly when they're going to go because they advertise them in advance. And even if we are not, if the researchers were not partnered with these companies, you could still have somebody passing out a questionnaire and asking all the mountaineers on the mountain if they'd like to participate in the questionnaire, and some of those would be using pre-acclimatization with normabaric hypoxia, especially if you're talking about the 8,000 meter mountains now. You know, you would be able to pick that up without having to design a perfect study.
Before the audio quality was not very good, but I would try to elaborate a bit on that. If I did understand right, you would know what is the real benefit when you are pre-acclimatizing and you are going to the very high mountains, to the 8,000, for example, right?
Yeah, so we know these companies like Alpenglow put their expeditions on the web, right? And they tell you the dates of their expeditions, or Mountain Madness tells you the dates of their Everest expedition, which is it's not surprising because Everest has a really short season. So what you can do is you can post somebody when these expeditions are running at Aconcagua or Everest, and you have a physician or somebody else passing out surveys and getting consent, and you're going to get surveys of all the mountaineers, not just the ones using hypoxic generators, but there will be some using hypoxic generators if you're at the right dates. But I think on the 8,000 meter mountains, you don't have to time the dates, because I think a lot of people are using the normabaric hypoxia on the 8,000 meters, but maybe less so on the smaller mountains. You would get, if you ask them a question about the generator training, you would get some responses, and you get to see the effects on AMS.
Yeah, it was also not really easy to perform such studies, because you'll probably have some mountaineers they pre-acclimatize, and there are in fact several mountaineers pre-acclimatizing, but every mountaineer are using different methods, using different protocols. Some are sleeping for several days in the tent, others are sleeping for weeks, all the nights in the tent. They are using very different doses. For example, they start with 2,000 meters and go up to simulated 4,000 meters, and others go up to 7,000 meters, and so on. And therefore, in any case, it will be very difficult to interpret. I think the best way to expose as many people as possible before going to high altitude, and then collect data, what happens, and are they all really prevented from acute mountain sickness, and they are happy with their performance. And I'm not sure whether you did refer to this Everest, commercial Everest, not study, but Everest expedition done by Lucas Furtenbach, the Everest Flash. Did you see that? And all these people pre-acclimatize in normabaric hypoxia, in hypoxia tents for 6 to 8 weeks, spending the nights there, collecting at least 200 to 300 hours, and then they climbed up quickly to about 6,000 meters, and from there they started with supplemental oxygen. But all these experiences collected from this expedition show that all these people tolerated very well this rapid ascent to 6,000 meters, and nobody of these people suffered from acute mountain sickness or for other altitude illnesses. And up to now, and hopefully it will go on, they all climbed Everest without problems.
Yeah, I think I did see that study. It didn't really have a statistical analysis, and maybe that's because it didn't have another control group. So I think if you're passing out surveys, then you automatically have that control group, because people are doing different things, and then you just ask them how many hours did they spend in the normabaric hypoxia, and some will say 0, and some will say 200 or 300, and some will say 10, and you can use that whatever number is said as a independent variable in a multivariate regression and see if it's significant.
Yeah, it's not easy to hear you, but yes, especially for these people, if we are talking about the danger, the Everest Flash, all these people, it was a pre-requirement that they have been controlled exposed to normabaric hypoxia, progressing, increasing the hypoxia level, that you are exposed to the target hypoxia, or at least close to the target hypoxia you will reach. And if you are exposed to this hypoxia level before, you probably will benefit. And what we learned from these people who have been exposed for 200 to 300 hours before going to altitude, we learned they tolerated afterwards the altitude very well without developing high altitude illnesses. But this is not the only observation. There are several other observations, but most of that from the case studies, it seems very obvious that normabaric hypoxia is appropriately used, will really work.
Is there anything about pre-acclimatization or normabaric hypoxia that you think I should have asked you about, but I didn't ask you about?
No, I think you asked the very most important things, and that is how long should we be exposed, and it's important that we induce ventilatory acclimatization at that needs time. You can do it at real altitude, but then you need time. You need several days, and you probably will suffer when ascending a bit from acute mountain sickness and so on. And if you pre-acclimatize at home or near home at real altitude or using this normabaric hypoxia, you can really spare time on the mountain. You are more flexible. If weather conditions are changing, you can go up faster and so on. But you ask most important things. Should spend many hours before going. Otherwise, you will not benefit much. You should use it progressively.
Hey, I was just going to say, I'll put the full reference to the two papers I mentioned that you co-authored. But if people wanted to find out more about your research, where would be a good place for them to find that?
I think these two papers are quite good to use. Yes, and there are also some several references to pre-acclimatization and to studies, effects of studies who used pre-acclimatization before going to high altitude, and otherwise you could even provide my email, and they could contact me, and I could prefer literature or even advice how to do that.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time, Martin. Thank you, and so much good advice.
Thank you very much, and sorry, audio quality and our contact was not so good, but hopefully it would be helpful at least a little.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, subscribe if you're on YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast feed wherever you're getting it. Thanks for listening to the Slow Boat Sailing Podcast. I'm Linus Wilson. Bye-bye.